Alwa's Awakening is an adventure game from Eldin Pixels. Originally released in 2017, it drew heavy stylistic inspiration from 8-bit NES games, and now in 2021, we've created a version that runs on the actual NES. I'm Brad Smith, the lead programmer for this NES project, and I'd like to share some of its development process with you. In part 1 of this series, we looked at how the world's background graphics were put together. In this part, we'll show you how we filled the world with things that move and animate. The NES graphics hardware has two major systems in it. The first system is for a scrolling background layer. We describe this in detail in part 1, but the short story is that it's a grid of tiles that covers the whole screen. You can't make changes to the background layer very quickly, so it's mostly useful for things that don't move, like the ground and the sky. The second system is the complementary opposite. It's made for things that move and animate, known as sprites. Instead of being tiles on a grid, you can place each tile anywhere you want on the screen. It also has a dedicated hardware device that can quickly update every sprite on every frame. However, because the sprites are so versatile, the hardware can't handle very many of them. The background grid shows nearly 1,000 tiles across the screen, but sprites are limited to just 64 tiles. They're responsible for displaying most of the action of gameplay, but they can only cover 1 or 2% of the screen. This is why two systems are needed. The background layer provides coverage for the bulk of the screen, but does a poor job with animation. The sprites are great for animation and motion, but the power of the hardware couldn't handle very many of them. The sprites are made up of 8x8 pixel tiles, and their data is 2 bits per pixel. This means that every pixel can have one of 4 values. 3 of them are assigned to colors, and 1 is reserved as a transparency. As with the backgrounds, the hardware provides 4 color palettes to use for sprites, each with 3 colors. You can change the colors in these palettes as often as you like, but in any given frame, every sprite tile has to use one of these 4 color sets. Managing the 4 sprite palettes and how the characters use them tends to have a big impact on how an NES game is designed. For a quick example, you may have noticed that the color of power-ups in Mega Man games depend on which weapon you have selected. This is because they share the same palette as Mega Man's armor. In Lizard, I reserved 2 palettes for the character, one for their current lizard color, and one for their skin tones. This left me with 2 additional palettes that I could change from room to room to accommodate different combinations of items and characters. Because I wanted to make sure that each type of creature always appeared using the same colors, this often dictated which ones could be in the same room. So the limited palettes didn't just affect the game visually, but also guided a lot of level design decisions. For Alwa's Awakening, it worked the other way. The pre-existing design of the game ended up dictating how we could use the 4 palettes. We needed colors for the player's appearance as Zoe, but also she has 3 magical abilities that can be used anywhere in the game, and all 3 at the same time. So we tried a few variations, but settled on 4 color sets that could fit all of these things, and also be used for enemies and other characters. We have black, purple, and white for Zoe's clothing. Orange for her face combined with red and white. The orange and white can be used for her lightning ability, and the red makes it suitable for fireballs, or the health indicators in the status bar at the top of the screen. 2 greens and a pale yellow for the cube of Zoe. 2 blues and a white for the bubble, as well as the blue orb in the status bar. Since all 4 of the palettes are already spoken for by the player character and the things she can do, every enemy in the game had to be made to fit this set of palettes. This is one of the biggest visual differences between the original game and the NES version. You can layer sprite tiles to combine more than one palette group in a single character, such as how Zoe's face uses a different group than her clothing. But due to the limitations we have to work with, in most cases, it was better to try and reduce a character to using a single palette group rather than layering. If you were following the development of this game, you may have seen some early footage of these Chuck enemies that have more colors than in the final version. This shows something that was possible with layering, but in the context of the whole game, it was helpful in several ways to reduce them to more efficient single palette versions. Most of the characters were adapted from the original with very little changed besides their coloring. Some of them had more than 3 colors to start with, or were using colors a little bit outside the ones we settled on. But in the end, I think everything came across quite well on the NES. The boss characters had to be adapted the most, but we'll talk about that more in the next video. If you've played NES games, you're probably very familiar with the way sprites tend to flicker when the action gets busy. I was surprised when I learned that the flickering isn't a hardware feature of the NES. Instead, it's just a common software technique to cope with a hardware limitation. In addition to the limit of 64 sprite tiles on screen, there's a second limit of 8 tiles on each line. This is another hardware design decision to keep complexity down. The NES's GPU has enough memory to store 64 sprites, but it does rendering line by line, and it only has 8 internal sprite units that can draw pixels on a single line. So on each line, it goes through the list of 64 sprites, and if any tile overlaps the current line, it gets assigned to an internal sprite unit. This always goes in order, so the sprite that comes earliest in the list always appears on top. This lets you layer things so that one thing goes in front of another. But if you ever have more than 8 sprite tiles on a single line, some of them can't be assigned to a sprite unit, and they just disappear. So what a lot of games do is shuffle the order of their sprites every frame. When the limit isn't exceeded, this isn't noticeable, but when the sprites start to drop out, it's not the same one every time. Every sprite takes a turn, and at least you get to see each of them for some of the time. Most NES games have some sort of flickering system like this, but there are a few that don't. In Bayou Billy, they wanted characters to overlap in a specific order, so that you could have Billy walk behind an enemy without appearing on top of them. But the downside you can see is that when the limit is exceeded, one of the characters will just completely disappear. Because the ordering was more important to them, they had to accept that problem as a trade-off. Alwa's Awakening has taken a fairly standard approach where all sprites can participate in shuffling. This was important because, especially with her abilities to cast a block, bubble, and lightning bolt, it's easy for the player to create a situation with too much overlap. It was important that none of these drop out entirely, as they're all important to gameplay. This was one of the reasons why we tried to avoid layering sprites, except in special cases. Layered sprites are more likely to exceed the 8 per line limit. One place we made an exception was with the human characters found throughout the game. Since they normally appear in rooms without other action, it felt safe to use layered colors. However, you can probably still get them to flicker by using your abilities around them. Another big limitation is the memory for storing tiles. The NES has 8 kilobytes of memory space, which allow 256 tiles for backgrounds and 256 more for sprites. Early NES games had to make their entire game from just 256 unique tiles like this, but eventually extra hardware was added inside cartridges to work around this limitation. There's 2 main hardware approaches to this. One way is to divide the memory space into pages called banks, which we can swap out at any time. With this method, you get instant access to a much larger set of tiles, but because the pages are usually groups of 64 or 128 tiles, you tend to have to do a lot of planning for which tiles belong together in which page. For instance, these animated tiles in Super Mario Bros. 3 all had to be packed together in a single page, but only a few of them are seen at any given time. The other way, which we used in Alwa's Awakening, is to replace the graphics ROM with RAM instead. This allows you to read and write individual tiles as needed, but with the drawback that switching your graphics is no longer an instant operation. Whenever the screen goes black, you can reload the RAM with whatever tiles you want, and this gives you a ton of flexibility. Each enemy can take up only as many tiles as it needs, and it makes it a lot easier to combine different things. However, if you want to change tiles in the middle of a room, it gets a lot trickier. Updating tile RAM uses the same method as updating backgrounds, and it's relatively slow. Each 8x8 pixel tile takes 16 bytes of data, which has to be uploaded to the GPU byte by byte. It also has to be done in the short time between frames known as the vertical blank. Exactly how much you can upload during the vertical blank depends on the game, but for this game we had 128 bytes of bandwidth here, allowing us to replace up to 8 tiles in a single frame. So the reason we need to worry about updating between frames is that Zoe has an awful lot of unique sprites for an NES character. In some cases, we might be able to share tiles between some of them, like if her head is the same in 2 places, or how the climbing sprites are symmetrical and can just be mirror flipped. But even with that, she has a total of 228 unique tiles that might be needed anywhere in the game. If we loaded all of these at once, there wouldn't be enough room left over for anything else. However, her animations always come in sequences. So even though the player can press a button and start a new sequence anytime they want, everything that comes afterward could be loaded on demand. So I took just the first frame of each of her animation sequences, Zoe standing still, the first frame of her walk, the first frame of a jump, the first frame of her swinging the rod, anything the player can trigger instantly. This cut the always loaded set down to just 105 tiles. Finally, there's 2 sets of 13 tiles reserved to load whatever other sprite might be needed next. Since most of her animations spend about 5 or more frames before proceeding to the next sprite, that gives more than enough time to load the 13 tiles needed for the next one before it appears. This technique allowed Zoe to keep her full animation set from the original game without having to sacrifice anything. Having this tile update system also permitted animating other tiles, like these waterfalls, in the same way. Alwa's Awakening has a few places where you can walk behind the walls. You might remember seeing something like this in DuckTales, or traveling behind the lava in Metroid. This showcases another hardware feature of NES sprites, which is not very often used. The NES allows you to place each sprite tile either in front of or behind the background. Most of the time, we would want the sprites to be on top, since they convey most of the action of the game, but sometimes we want the appearance of a character passing in behind. In Alwa's case, it helps improve the sense that this is a hidden passage. If Zoe appeared on top instead, it gives a very different impression. This kind of layering would be a normal feature for later 16-bit game systems, but for the NES, it was a little bit novel. If we take a look at Legacy of the Wizard, we can find a few enemies that are able to hide behind the walls. These enemies will be safe from your attacks until you get up close, and then they suddenly jump out at you. However, this game was originally released under the name Dragon Slayer 4 on the MSX2, which didn't have this hardware feature for its sprites. In the original version of the game, this enemy behavior just doesn't exist. It appears to be a new idea they had for the NES version, inspired by this new hardware feature. So, that's the second major step for bringing Alwa's Awakening to the NES. Now we can fill our world with characters, enemies, and items. We have things that move and animate, so that we can start to interact with them. In the next part, we'll take a look at one of the game's bosses and some of the unique development challenges it posed. If you'd like to know more about the game, please go to eldenpixels.com, where you can find information about Alwa's Awakening and its sequel Alwa's Legacy. If you'd like to know more about its NES version, keep watching this channel. Thanks for listening.